All right, welcome everyone to the public hearing for the safety plan and the code of conduct. I'd like to introduce our new Director of Facilities, Darren Price, and our Executive Director of Operations and Special Projects, Jonathan Salzberg.
Thank you everyone for being here. Tonight we're going to have our public hearing, which is required for the SAVE plan to review any changes as well as present for future adoption after the plan itself is posted for review in the superintendent's office for 30 days, as well as code of conduct changes that have been considered by the district safety committee. For the purposes of the public hearing, try and do this. Should work. So for procedures for the public hearing, Marcy Clapper was open the hearing. Obviously, the hearing itself is being recorded, so you can keep that in mind when you're making your remarks. Comment period will follow each of the presentation periods. Commenters obviously sign in sheets as announced. Limit of 5 minutes per speaker, and please identify yourself when speaking. The hearing itself is really about letting the board know about public opinion or staff opinion and getting that out there. We do have 5 board members here with us this evening. For our agenda purposes, we'll start off with Mr. Price talking about the SAVE plan and any updates that we'll be making to the SAVE plan. We'll have a brief comment period if anyone has signed up to comment for the SAVE plan, and then we'll look at the code of conduct proposed changes that were reviewed with the safety committee, and then again have another comment period. Once the hearing closes, then we will anticipate moving into the board meeting, which was scheduled for 6 o'clock. Unless there's a break in between. So start off. Go ahead, Darren. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Darren Price, Director of Facilities. So I'm just going to go through a series of slides, as Jonathan mentioned, to discuss the proposed revisions to our SAVE plan. So the SAVE plan is really supported by the District Safety Committee. We meet on a monthly basis throughout the school year to review potential changes to the plan, as well as the code of conduct, the SAFE plan, as well as the code of conduct. And then we make recommendations to the Board of Education for both documents. The group is made up of a diverse members of the community. We have parent reps, members of the board are on there. Our community programs director is on there. We have folks from EMS, as well as our capital construction team on there, as well as our current director of security. In addition, we have members from our student information systems, food service, special ed, as well as the teachers rep. So the SAFE plan is a requirement for us here in New York State to really address the hazards regarding crisis intervention, emergency response management, and recovery that we'll face in the school district. The plan requires a public review period, which would take place after this meeting here for a period of 30 days. All plans must include policies and procedures, and these are just examples. Threats to violence, responding to acts of violence, protocol for specific threats, safe evacuation during any violent incident, and how we contact law enforcement and families during and after a violent incident. So some changes that would typically take place, any new personnel, so removing names off and putting new names on, telephone number updating, equipment inventories that we have from district, building inventories, most of those don't change on a year-to-year basis. In addition, the district resources and any grammatical errors. A new section that is added this year is the pandemic response section, which has been required by the state of New York. So the safety committee, as I mentioned, meets on a monthly basis And we review safety-related items in my department. And some of the things that we've improved on over the past year have been continued conducting individual breeder training at each of our buildings. We added a security guard position, which is split between the middle school and the high school. Our routine security reviews are walk through all buildings. We account for every building evacuation or building emergency drill. So that's a lockdown, your lockdowns and your fire drills. We account for those and we submit those to SED on an annual basis for every one of our school buildings as well as the administrative building. We worked with Alteris this year, something new, very new for us. We worked with a group of Alteris who helped prepare a really comprehensive safety and security review for our district. So we've had continued conversion of the analog, a very old analog camera system into a new IP-based camera system. We've installed approximately 40 new cameras, both interior and exterior cameras at the high school. And we've held training for the administrators most recently on that system, specifically at the high school. And we participate in the district threat assessment meetings. So those are regularly scheduled throughout the course of the school year. We continue to maintain an increased level of security presence at varsity sports level games. And for the 17th year, we received the highest level of school safety award for insurance carrier Utica National. So for the next 6 months, we have a lot of work ahead of us. We've just begun to onboard a new senior security supervisor. Alteris, as I mentioned, provided for us a really comprehensive safety and security review. Jonathan and I have been working to create a prioritization list for that. Implementing priorities to improve overall level of safety and security is something that we continue to work through. We are going to upgrade and move the security office at the high school. Right now, the security office is fairly small. We're moving it to house all of our security personnel, as well as outside LEO support. And our anticipation of hiring our new director of security. So those are some of the major highlights that we expect to tackle over the next 6 months. So now's the time for, we're going to open up to any comments for anyone.
I don't believe anybody wanted to comment after this portion of it. Is that correct? Anybody? If not, we'll proceed with the code of conduct update. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. So Code of Conduct proposed revisions. These are the same revisions that were presented to the board at our last meeting. So we'll touch on each of these and then we'll have a comment period just like we did for the SAVE plan. So as you know, the Code of Conduct provides for the maintenance of an order on school grounds. It applies to both students, staff, as well as visitors on school ground. It is reviewed and approved by the Board of Education each year after a public hearing. This is, I believe, our second time this year. We had a public hearing earlier in the year regarding an appendix that used to be attached to the Code of Conduct. But once the code is adopted by the board, we then upload it to SED within 30 days after it is adopted. So this year, the proposed changes include with the introduction, the addition of 2 paragraphs, one of which was proposed by the Equity Committee for the policy on student suspension, as well as another paragraph just referencing and restorative justice as providing guidance, if you will, to the interpretation of the Code of Conduct and the application of the Code of Conduct. Tip line. So this was one of a recommendation from our Alteris consultant was to further advertise the tip line to district families and residents. In this case, we're adding a page to the code of conduct to reference the confidential tip line that the district has been using for some time. It has the phone number there as well as a way to access this. So during our last presentation, there were some questions regarding the tip line itself by one of the board members. So we're currently exploring some options to create either through the web portal or through a form a way to have a more anonymous reporting system and further spin that out, if you will, to the students and families. If we get that done prior to, hopefully we get that done prior to the board adopting the code of conduct at the next meeting, or rather 30 days from now, then we'll be able to take that link and put it right in the code of conduct as well, so that there's that additional layer of advertising to families and students, another way to report or give anonymous tips of potential violence, if you will. So prohibited student behavior. This is a proposed change. One of the prohibited behaviors is possessing a weapon. However, after the wording possessing a weapon, there's a sentence that authorized law enforcement officials are the only persons permitted to have a weapon in their possession while on school property or at a school event. So this, as a result of a student hearing, a student was in possession of an X-Acto knife which he or she had acquired in the school. And when the student was found, went to the hearing officer actually found the student not guilty of possessing the X-Acto knife because of this very sentence. The argument being that if the teacher had the X-Acto knife, it could not be considered a weapon because only law enforcement officials are the ones allowed to possess weapons. Therefore, the student himself was not in possession of a weapon. So really just to kind of address that and prevent that anomalous result, if you will, the proposal was to eliminate this sentence. If we were not to eliminate the sentence, there is an alternative. We could talk about modifying the wording. The wording that I have on the screen here, possessing a weapon in or on school property or school function, which is the prohibited behavior, except in the case of law enforcement officers or except as specifically authorized by the district. This I borrowed from the Brockport Central School District Code of Conduct. When the resulting hearing that came out of the first one went out, a number of districts modified their codes of conduct to try and address and prevent the very situation that arose here in Spencerport. If you look at the modified wording, it would still prohibit possessing a weapon, but using the exception, then the law enforcement officers could possess it, and it would seem to diminish any chance of an argument at a student hearing, where a student may acquire the X-Acto knife essentially from an art group or other method. Additional penalty, page 27. This was really to make sure students and families are on notice that a student could have their rights or access suspended or revoked as a potential penalty in case of misconduct, whether that be, malicious emails, internet searches, hacking, whatever you want to call it. We felt it was necessary to actually put the families on notice that this was a possibility. It is I believe, in our acceptable use policies as well, but adding it to the code of conduct just adds an additional layer. Most of the acceptable use policy is also incorporated in the code of conduct, so adding this into the quote penalty area was really just a notice opportunity to let everybody know about this. And then mandatory minimums. So this generated a lot of discussion during our last meeting. In the code of conduct, there are a few paragraphs regarding mandatory minimums. Number one, which you don't see here, is firearms. That is governed by the Gun-Free Schools Act. There's a minimum suspension of 1 year, which the superintendent can then modify on a case-by-case basis. This is paragraph 2, which is considering violent acts other than bringing a firearm to school. So in our code of conduct, violent acts could include things such as a ninth grader who verbally threatens or intimidates someone. It could include a third grader who scratches another student, or it could include a student with a disability who hits or bites a staff member. Each of those may have 3 different reactions from a suspension level from either the principal or the superintendent if those were to go to a hearing. This is regarding what is essentially a short-term suspension, but it has a mandatory minimum of at least 2 days. Now, the statute itself, Education Law 2801, does require the district to have a mandatory minimum in place. Essentially, this minimum is the same language that was put forth in the New York State School Board's sample code of conduct that was issued a number of years ago. And if you look at the codes around, even just in our county, a majority of them still have the same language that is in exact language that is in the sample code of conduct that came from the New York State School Board. What we have done here is proposed a change to that to, I don't know if you want to say, be a little bit more specific to the Spencerport students, if you will, as opposed to simply just taking on a sample from another organization. But in this case, it eliminates the shall be suspended for at least 2 days and makes it a may be suspended from school. Even in the case of a 2-day suspension, there's still a line at the end where the principal has the authority to modify the minimum 2-day suspension on a case-by-case basis. After our last board meeting, a little more research, yes, we were able to find that a year or 2 later, New York State School Boards reduced their mandatory minimum from 2 days down to 1 day in their policy, their sample code of conduct, which really was geared towards incorporating more restorative practices. That is, a potential alternative as opposed to simply removing it down to what is essentially 0 at this point. But you could arguably, with the principal having the authority to modify the minimum 2-day suspension, it really is up to the administrator handling the incident in that case. Paragraph 3, again, mandatory minimums. In this case, this is really geared towards students who are repeatedly substantially disruptive of the educational process. Now, there's a very specific definition for this, and it means engaging in conduct that results in the student being removed from the classroom by the teacher pursuant to Education Law 3214 on 4 or more occasions during a semester or 3 or more occasions during a trimester. You can see that the mere fact that it references a trimester, this language was simply copied from another area because Spencerport doesn't have trimesters. So that alone needs a little bit of updating. But the paragraph below really talks about the minimum 5-day suspension for any of this type of behaviors. The proposal here is really just to take the 5-day and eliminate the minimum suspension. That being said, even if the board was to choose to reduce it to 1 day or keep it at the 5 days, it still includes the language that the principal and the superintendent have the right to modify. That's the suspension. Then finally, paragraph 4 from the mandatory minimum section. I apologize, I can't see that far, so I'm looking here to make sure I don't miss anything. Is with respect to alcohol, drugs, and drug paraphernalia. So from a historical standpoint, probably 2011, I think this was upped from 10 to 20 weeks in there. And then within the last 5 years, it was lowered down to 5 to 20 weeks to reduce that minimum. Now the proposal is to further take that down to essentially not have a stated minimum in the code of conduct. With the changes in the legalization of marijuana, as well as other things and the perspectives that have changed and the students that we're seeing, the traditional hardcore remove a student from the educational system is not always the best option for these students. But that is how it has been applied in any number of districts, and it was applied when I was, doing the hearings. That was the standard. This would allow a lot more discretion in the hands of the superintendent to address those situations on a case-by-case basis with respect to whether it's possession, whether it's use, how we get to that point. Then this just simply modifies that so it doesn't have that stated 5 to 20 weeks as a mandatory minimum for those suspensions. Even in this case where it says the second and subsequent offenses will result in a long-term suspension from school for a minimum of 20 school weeks. That's kind of an arbitrary number that has been applied across the county for 10 to 15 years. I've never heard of an actual study that shows 20 school weeks is of a benefit to a student who's already using drugs and is more than happy to stay home from school. So that's a perspective that we've talked about when we were discussing removing the mandatory minimum in this case. And so removing that language would allow a lot of discretion, both in the hearing officer's hands as well as the superintendent hands, to apply this on an as-needed basis and implement suspensions that really fit the crime, if you will, as opposed to just doing mandatory minimums. And in this case, just as an example, a couple examples, the mandatory minimum could apply to an 11th grader who has drugs in school. That's your traditional hearing. But also it could apply to a 5th grader who brings his brother's vape to school, or it could apply to a 2nd grader who brings Tylenol to school. Any number of those would they fit this situation? I don't see that every one of those requires the minimum 5 to 20 week suspension. But the traditional way of application is where that would go for those examples. So those were the proposed changes that we had put forth to the board at the last meeting. Again, we'll have a public comment period, if you will. I think we have one person signed up, possibly one more. The podium is right there. Then I just ask that you identify yourself when you come up to speak. Once Ms. Clapper gives you the chance, and that we limit comments to approximately 5 minutes.
Okay, at this time, we're going to allow 5 minutes for public comment. So first we have Christina Bachner.
Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Christina Buckner. I am a parent of 2 students attending the district as well as a teacher at the high school. I am here to speak about concerns I have about the proposed changes to the code of conduct regarding violent acts and minimum suspensions. I did email the board last night with concerns, but I'm going to expand upon them now. This year as a teacher, I have witnessed more fights between students than I have ever in my 18 years as a teacher. I've had to leave my room numerous times to break fights up in the hallway. Some of these students were in multiple physical altercations almost on a weekly basis. As soon as they returned from their suspension, some of them were soon suspended again for fighting. Some students getting in multiple fights within a single day. I was going to say that I've had 2 staff members that have been struck in the process of this, but I just heard of a 3rd today of a staff member being hit in the middle of a student fight. I have also witnessed more disrespect thrown at teachers and staff than ever before. Students swearing at teachers, telling them to shut the bleep off, you bleep. I have read through all 300 plus comments on this SWAN survey. The most obvious trend on this survey that I see is student behavior and the district's discipline or lack thereof. I am concerned for not only my safety, but that of my children and my students, and I am not alone. I have talked to numerous parents who are thinking of removing their children from Spencerport schools, sending them to private schools, moving out of the district. How can you read these comments on that survey and think that the changes you are proposing are a good idea? Last night, as I tried to digest this change, I watched the June 7th board meeting and I walked away with a few thoughts and questions. Regarding the 9th, 3rd grade and special education students that was brought up with a minimum suspension. I disagree with what you said. First, the special education student given in that example can have a manifestation hearing. So they already have the chance to lower their consequences. For the 3rd and 9th grade student, I agree that they probably do not deserve the same consequence. However, can we change the code of conduct to reflect that? Have a minimum consequence for primary and one for secondary students. 2, during that board meeting, several board meeting members voiced that perhaps we should be talking to teachers and staff about their thoughts regarding this policy. Why was this not done? Yes, you may get many different responses, as Mr. Bracken pointed out in that meeting, but our input still matters as we are the ones dealing with these issues day in and day out. I invite each and every one of you to our building to observe these altercations yourselves. Number 3, after reading the proposed changes and listening to the board meeting last night, I did some research about consequences and restorative justice practices, and I read one article, which I will now quote, a 2018 study found that suspending students for nonviolent misconduct does not benefit the misbehaving students or their peers. Restorative justice can serve as a valuable tool to help students process nonviolent behavior, but violent behavior, even under restorative justice, often demands a period of time during which the student should be off of the school property. I would like to see the research that was done by the district in removing a mandatory minimum for violent behavior. And number 4, if the consequence is not suspension, what is it? In the last board meeting, board members brought up giving discretion to administrators. That is way too ambiguous to be what is put in place. Next year, we will have 6 assistant principals between the middle and high schools. 3 of these will be new hires, some of them with no administrative experience. 2 of the remaining 6 are untenured with only 1 or 3 years of experience. Only 1 is a tenured, long-acting assistant principal in this district. It is my fear that if there is no clear guidance from the district, that due to that lack of experience, these administrators could be pressured by parents to not give an adequate consequence, and the behaviors will only get worse. I have a friend who has a high school student who was asked by an administrator, what should be the punishment for your child? It is also my fear that not having clear guidance to follow will result in widely varied consequences, creating discord between students, parents, and administrators. It is my belief that anyone proposing such changes to our code of conduct does not have a pulse on what is going on in the buildings of this district. If you have stepped foot in our buildings and observed what is happening, you would not be proposing such changes without a clear, consistent plan for dealing with these safety issues in its place. Without having such a replacement plan in place for dealing with violent behavior, removing the minimum suspension time from the code of conduct will change a growing problem into a crisis, causing student behaviors to spiral out of control. I attended the 8th grade moving up ceremony last week, and I was embarrassed by the behavior that I witnessed that was not addressed. This will result in teachers having to spend more time on discipline within the classroom and less time actually teaching. We witnessed this occurring this year, and the problem will only get worse. We need to address student behavior and consequences that our children can get back to learning and students and staff can feel safe again. I would really like to know what the plan is with the removal of minimum suspension time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Buckner. Okay, now we'd like to hear from Ms. Marcy Rush, please. You have 5 minutes to speak. Thank you.
Hi, Marcy Rush, parent in the district. I came tonight to kind of just look for some additional information on the topics provided. So thank you for that. And as I sat there, so many things were going through my head. I am an educator in a local district. And I was also trained at Peoria in restorative practices. And my understanding is that restorative practices cannot replace suspension. They're meant to be proactive or to mitigate potential issues. And my son this year experienced an attack on the lacrosse field. So I understand it's not a school hallway. However, the suggestion was to get into a peace circle the very next day. And I just wanted to share tonight for consideration that as a parent, the last thing a child who's been attacked wants to do is get into a room with the person the next day. So I am a firm believer in restorative practices, and I feel like it does have a place in our school system. I do not think that when we are considering some of the behaviors that are observed, that we can consider lowering the suspension minimum and then replacing it with restorative practices. So I guess number one, I just wanted to make sure that I heard that correct in tonight's presentation. Because I did hear that. I came here tonight to figure out what was the reason for lowering that. And that did come up. So that's my first question. Because I don't believe that those are a match. And then the next thing I wanted to say is that when Mrs. Buckner was speaking about the research on the amount of time that somebody should be, let's say, out of the building after an attack or a fight or abusive language, whatever we're calling the example tonight. It's very unnerving for the victim to have to return to the same space and place and watch the other student just carry on. And they feel violated and less safe in their schools. So I definitely am struggling with this piece of the code of conduct tonight. And then I'd also like to echo that I did too also notice as a parent, the 300+ comments, especially at the end, that this is larger than maybe just two of us speaking tonight. I think we represent a lot of families that we live together on our streets, families in our circles on the athletic field, or just in our social circles with our children. There are definitely a lot of concerns, and I do have friends who have not entered the middle school yet, but who are extremely concerned about putting their children in that environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rush. I believe that's everyone. Is there anybody else that wished to speak about the code of conduct? Thank you for your conduct or your comments.
I would say, I don't know, because I know you have a 6 o'clock board meeting.
Okay, yeah.
So my name is Jennifer Ikes. I have 2 children in the district. My daughter's going to be a senior next year. And my son is going to be going into the high school in another year. He's a 7th grader. I've seen it escalate. We knew that this was coming after COVID. It's happening in all districts. I also am an educator in another district. I just want to say that I don't think there's a person in this room that doesn't have our children's best interests at heart. I know we all care about the children. We want to do what's best for them. But I am concerned about the restorative practice. I agree with Marcy, and you spoke so eloquently about what you're dealing with at the high school level. And I do know teachers that are also there with you. I won't name them, but they also share your sentiment. And it's very concerning. And this is by no means a threat, but I am toying with the idea of taking my son out of the district and not having him to high school, which would be, I can't even talk about it. It breaks my heart. But I'm very concerned about our children and what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis. And this community has always been so wonderful. And the district has been outstanding. And I still think it's an outstanding district. But we're seeing these behaviors rise, and I'm hearing about, my friends and colleagues' children getting not only physically hurt, but mentally abused. And I just want to know what direction the district plans on going in, apart from restorative practice. When we take away, and we're playing on words too a little bit when I was reading the proposal, I saw words like, may or shall, and those words intertwining. It's very confusing. So when you're sitting down reading this, it looks like there's not a lot of changes, but I'm wondering, is there going to be some major changes? And what will that look like? And I just feel like this should be discussed more. I'd like more opportunities for the community to come out. I'm embarrassed to say that I really didn't fully understand this until about 24 hours ago when it was pointed out to me. And I moved mountains to be here tonight. I was already planning on being here at 6 o'clock, but like I said, I moved mountains to get here at 5:30 so that I could hear and I could listen and I could be a part of this. So I just hope the board and the district here's the 3 people that spoke tonight and looks at those 300+ comments, like Ms. Rush just said it, and understands that it's bigger than just 3 of us speaking here.
Thank you, Ms. Ikes. Okay, if there's no one else wishing to speak regarding the code of conduct, that will end this portion of the evening. We'll take a short break before we begin the board meeting. Okay, thank you very much.